And it is my hope that the House, when they act tonight, will act in the spirit of compromise and the common good and allow this government to remain open. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back the floor. And noting the absence of a quorum,
the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Is there a quorum call proceeding?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Thank you, Madam President. In that case, I ask unanimous consent to end the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise again to urge both the House and this body to pass into law what should be the rule and the law for everything we do in Washington, and that is to apply the same rules to Washington as are applied to the rest of America, across the board, certainly including in Obamacare. Of course, Madam President, what I'm talking about is ending the special Washington exemption from Obamacare. That exemption is moving forward under what I consider a clearly illegal rule issued by the Obama administration. And it's illegal because it's contrary to the statute, contrary to the clear language, contrary to the clear intent of an Obamacare provision that says every member of Congress, all congressional staff, need to be treated like the millions of other Americans who are going to the so-called exchanges for their health care, 8 million against their will, losing their previous employer-provided subsidy. Now, Mr. President, let me recount briefly the history of this because it's important. Several years ago, during the Obamacare debate, there was a proposal made by many, including myself, and one of the leaders was Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. And that proposal was actually adopted, amazingly, to my surprise, pleasant surprise at the time, adopted and put in the Obamacare bill. And it said just what I mentioned a few minutes ago. Every member of Congress, all congressional staff, need to go to the so-called exchanges for their health care, need to leave our present system, Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan, with our employer-provided subsidy. The idea was simple and was a good one, that we would actually walk in the shoes of other Americans who are living under the challenges and the burdens of this law, including having to get our health care in the exchanges with no special deal, no special subsidy, no special exemption. And that law was passed as part of Obamacare. Pure and simple, exactly those words. Now, Madam President, I guess it was an example of what Nancy Pelosi said. You know, we need to pass the law in order to figure out what's in it. Because after the law passed, with that language in it, lots of folks on Capitol Hill started reading that, and they said, oh, you know what? We can't stand for this. We can't live by that. We can't be subject to the same situation as other Americans. And so there was furious scheming and gnashing of teeth about how we're going to get out of this burden, even though there was very little broad-based discussion about how we're going to get all Americans out of that burden that they were subjected to. Well, that developed into furious lobbying of the Obama administration, many folks led in the Senate by the distinguished Majority Leader Harry Reid saying, Mr. President, you need to issue a special rule that exempts Congress, that takes the pain out of that provision, a special, unique, special rules, special deal, special bailout for Congress. And sure enough, that's what the Obama administration did, conveniently, right after we left hand for the August recess, right after Congress got away from the scene of the crime. According to numerous press reports that are not rebutted, President Obama personally got involved. He personally had discussions within his administration at the urging of Harry Reid and others, and he ensured that this special rule was issued. And it does two things, basically. Number one, it says that even though the Obamacare statute states plainly and clearly that every member of Congress and all official congressional staff have to go to the exchanges, well, we don't know what official staff is, so we're going to leave that up to each individual member of Congress, and we're not going to second-guess that. So an individual member of Congress can say, oh, these folks aren't covered by that mandate. They can stay in their current plan. They don't have to be disrupted. In theory, a member of Congress can say, nobody on my staff is part of my official staff for purposes of this mandate. That is silly and ridiculous on its face because the statute is clear. The second thing this illegal rule does is it says that for members and any staff who do go to the exchange, what's supposed to be the fallback position for Americans and for Congress, for members and staff who do go to the exchange, they get to take their very generous taxpayer-funded subsidy with them, even though that's not available to any other person losing employer-based coverage going to the exchange against his or her will. So that deal isn't available to anyone but the select ruling class. That's why, Madam President, I think this rule is completely illegal, and that's why I know it flies in the face of what I consider the first most basic rule of democracy, that laws passed here by Congress, by Washington, should be applied to Washington just the same as they're applied to America. That should be true in Obamacare. That should be true across the board. To react to this illegal Obama administration rule, Madam President, I joined together with many colleagues in the Senate, and I want to thank all of my co-sponsors, Senator Enzi, Senator Heller, Senator several others, excuse me, I'm forgetting the entire list, and members of the House who have identical legislation and identical language. They're led by Congressman Ron DeSantis of Florida. Ron Johnson is another colleague I was trying to think of Wisconsin, who's a leading co-author. I want to thank all of them for leading this fight. And our language does two simple things. First of all, it negates this illegal Obama administration rule. That's a special exemption, a special bailout for Congress against the clear language and intent of Obamacare. Secondly, it broadens that rule and also applies it to the President and the Vice President and all of their political appointees. That is the no Washington exemption language. That is the Vitter Amendment here in the Senate with many other co-sponsors. That is the DeSantis Amendment in the House with many House co-sponsors. And I urge all of my colleagues to come together around that common sense, fair language, which again simply ensures what I think should be Rule 1 of our American democracy. Whatever Congress passes for America, it applies equally to itself. Whatever Washington imposes on America, it applies equally to Washington, to policymakers in Washington. And, Madam President, we're making progress because there are reports that the House may very well take up this exact language tonight as part of the continuing discussion about a spending bill. And I urge the House to do that, to stand with the American people, not to stand with Washington, to stand tall with the American people and say, yes, it should be that even playing field, and whatever is passed on America should be applied equally in the same way. No special deals or exemptions or subsidies should be applied equally to Washington. And I urge all of my colleagues here, Republicans and Democrats, to support that effort, to support that simple, basic, fair language, to support it on Obamacare, to support it across the board, because it is essential that what Washington passes on America is applied with equal force and effect to Washington. If we did that on Obamacare, I'm convinced that we would rush with greater determination, speed, and focus to fix the very real problems of Obamacare, because we would be vested in it. If we did that on other laws, I'm convinced it would have the same positive effect. And so let's do it, number one, because it's fair and right. Number two, because our personal interests should be completely aligned, should be the same as those of the American people. And that'll get us to act. That'll get us to fix things. That'll get us to fight in the right direction, Republicans and Democrats together. So again, Madam President, I urge support of this no Washington exemption language. I urge the House to vote positively on that tonight. I urge the Senate to accept that fundamental principle, that important language, which, as I said, I think is the first core rule of democracy. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from Massachusetts.
I ask unanimous consent the time for morning business with debate only be extended until 8 p.m. with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, and that the majority leader be recognized at 8 p.m.
Without objection.
Madam President, I come to the floor today in a state of disbelief. With millions of people out of work, with an economic recovery still far too fragile, with students and families being crushed by student loan debt, with millions of seniors denied their chance at one hot meal a day with Meals on Wheels, and millions of little children pushed out of Head Start because of a sequester, with the country hours away from a government shutdown and days away from a potential default on the nation's debt, the Republicans have decided that the single most important issue facing our nation is to change the law so that employers can deny women access to birth control coverage. In fact, letting employers decide whether women can get birth control covered on their insurance plans is so important that the Republicans are willing to shutter the government and potentially tank the economy over whether women can get access to birth control in the year 2013, not the year 1913, the year 2013. I have a daughter and I have granddaughters, and I will never vote to let a group of backward-looking ideologues cut women's access to birth control. We have lived in that world, and we are not going back. Not ever. This assault on birth control is just one more piece of an ongoing Republican assault on the orderly functioning of our government and the orderly functioning of our economy. In effect, the Republicans are trying to take the government and the economy hostage, threatening serious damage to both unless the President agrees to gut the Affordable Care Act. This assault is utterly bizarre. Congress passed the Affordable Care Act to solve real, honest-to-God problems. Our health care system is broken. 48 million people in this country had no health insurance. Women couldn't get access to cancer screenings. People with diabetes were denied health insurance because of pre-existing conditions. People with cancer hit the caps on health insurance spending. And health spending in this country was growing way too fast. So we worked hard, we compromised, we came up with a solution that will substantially improve the lives of millions of Americans, because that's the way democracy works. It is time to end the debate about whether the Affordable Care Act should exist and whether it should be funded. Congress voted for this law. President Obama signed this law. The Supreme Court upheld this law. The President ran for re-election on this law. In fact, his opponent said he would repeal it, and his opponent lost by 5 million votes. I see things like this, and I wonder what alternate reality some of my colleagues are living in. So let me be very clear about what is happening in the real world. The ACA is the law of the land. Millions of people are counting on it. People who need health care coverage, people who need insurance policies that don't disappear just when they are at their sickest. Women will get insurance coverage for birth control. The law is here to stay, and it will stay. Earlier today, the Senate emphasized that reality by flatly rejecting the Republicans' newest ransom note, just as we did last week. We should be having a real debate about our budget because we have real problems to solve. Earlier this year, automatic across-the-board cuts went into effect throughout the federal government. That's the sequester. The sequester hits American families where they live. During my visits to cities and towns across Massachusetts, I've heard from families, small business owners, and community development organizations from the Berkshires to the Cape. They tell me what it's like to try to stay afloat with mindless across-the-board spending cuts weighing them down. More than 1,000 employees at Westover Air Force Base and Barnes Air National Guard Base in western Massachusetts are facing furloughs. This fall, more than 2,000 Massachusetts kids couldn't get into Head Start because of cuts. And the Head Start program in Billerica will close completely at the end of this year. Federal workers across our state stand to lose as much as 30% of their salaries, and every one of those losses will tighten family budgets. And when families make less money, they have less to spend with local merchants, and less money to pay off bills, and less money to save, and less money to do all the things that keep our economy humming. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office says that ending the sequester would add 900,000 jobs to the economy by the end of next year. Next time you think about someone you know who is looking for a job or who's working part-time but hoping to get full-time work, think about the 900,000 jobs that the sequester has destroyed. Scientists and medical researchers in Massachusetts are also getting pounded by the sequester. They're working hard to expand our knowledge and develop new cures for devastating diseases. They're working on discoveries that will help us in ways we can't even imagine. Yet, here we are, bluntly hacking away at their funding, delaying their research, and cutting off promising new work before it even starts. Not because we have to, not because it's inevitable, but because Washington has its priorities all wrong, and it's making some truly terrible decisions. Consider the Framingham Heart Study. It's a generations-long study of the causes of heart disease, a study that has helped create groundbreaking advancements in medical knowledge. There are people across this country who are alive today, in part because of the work that began with this study. This study continues to yield extraordinary results, but it is scheduled to lose 40% of its funding. 40%. The next time you think of someone you love who has heart trouble, think about the sequester cutting one of the world premier heart research programs. Senate Democrats have put forward alternatives that would adequately fund the government while also addressing our budget deficits. Back in March, the Senate passed a budget that would have ended the sequester. Wasn't easy. We had to make some compromises. No one loved everything in the final bill, but we debated it and we passed it. This is what Congress is supposed to do. But after we did all of that, the Senate Republicans decided to filibuster the budget again and blocked us from going to work on a conference with the House on the final bill. This is pure obstruction, plain and simple. In July, the Senate attempted to pass the first of several appropriations bills to keep the government open and to end the sequester. We had a bipartisan transportation and housing bill that would have helped repair crumbling roads and bridges in our communities. It would have created more jobs, and it would have rolled back sequestration in these programs. But once again, Senate Republicans filibustered and blocked that bill. Now, we are just hours from the government running out of money. We haven't fixed the sequester because of all the obstruction. We haven't finished a budget because of all the obstruction. We haven't even passed a single appropriations bill because of all the obstruction. The least we can do, the bare minimum that we can do, would be to pass a continuing resolution to keep the doors open and the lights on. We can ensure that over 1 million federal workers aren't simply sent home for no reason. We can avoid a government shutdown. But the Republicans have refused to do even that. They have continued to threaten to shutter the government unless the President agrees to gut the Affordable Care Act. The Senate rejected that position twice, yet the Republican response has been to continue to threaten to shut the government down. These threats may continue, but they are not working, and they will never work, because this is democracy. And in a democracy, hostage tactics are the last resort for those who can't win their fights through elections, can't win their fights in Congress, can't win their fights for the presidency, and can't win their fights in the courts. For this right-wing minority, hostage-taking is all they have left, a last gasp of those who cannot cope with the realities of our democracy. The time has come for those legislators who cannot cope with the reality of our democracy to get out of the way so that those of us in both parties who understand that the American people sent us here to work for them can get back to work solving real problems faced by the American people. We have real work to do, and that's what we should be doing. Thank you, Madam President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I ask the consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, I urge leadership in the House of Representatives to simply schedule a vote on the Senate-passed bill. I understand a number of people in the majority party are going to vote no. I also believe that, and the presiding officer used to be in the House of Representatives, as I was many years ago, and it's a Democratic House, Democratic with a small d. They should schedule a vote. I believe that a majority of members of the House of Representatives would vote for the bipartisan continuing resolution that passed the Senate. I believe they'd pass it in the House if the Speaker of the House would let it come to a vote. And is the Speaker of the House going to be the Speaker of the radical right of the Republican Party, or is he going to be the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives? And fundamentally, that's the question. Is he going to be the Speaker of the radical right in the House of Representatives, or is he going to be the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives? If he chooses the latter, if he chooses before midnight, there won't be a government shutdown because a majority of the House of Representatives, not necessarily a majority of the Republicans, but a majority of those who took the oath of office on January 3rd of 2013, who were elected in November of 2012, then took that oath, I believe a majority of them will support it. Now, I think, Madam President, it's always a good idea to look back in time a little to things that happened in the past. We know that some 30 times, more than 30 times, when President Reagan was president, President Bush Sr., President Bush Jr., the Congress raised the debt ceiling, even with a Democratic Congress, without preconditions, without threatening to shut the government down, or without threatening default. And a number of times the same situation on continuing resolutions, passing budgets, all of those things. But never have we had never really have we had a body in this country, in the House of Representatives or the Senate, has there been a body of members who have tried repeatedly to have their way to, in a sense, put their political platform from the election the year before, to attach their political platform to a continuing resolution. And if they don't get that political platform attached, they're simply going to shut the government down. And that's really what's happening. And, you know, there's all this talk about the public doesn't like the Affordable Care Act. Some call it Obamacare. The official name, the Affordable Care Act, is. There's some talk from the House of Representatives, really ad nauseum, that they don't like the Affordable Care Act. And they say the public doesn't like the Affordable Care Act. But let's look at that. 2012, the President of the United States was reelected, strong support of the Affordable Care Act. In 2012, supporters, including the new presiding officer that just replaced the senator from Hawaii, was elected, supporter of the Affordable Care Act. I was reelected, supporter of the Affordable Care Act. A strong majority in the United States Senate, many of whom stood for reelection and were successful. In fact, 2 more were elected this time that held office prior to this election, that supported the Affordable Care Act. More people voted for members of Congress, for House candidates that supported the Affordable Care Act. More people voted for Democrats in the House races than Republicans, even though redistricting made the outcome a little different, obviously, from that. So the point is, Mr. President, that there is no public sentiment to shut the government down in order to defund or repeal or hold back or delay or emasculate or pull apart or whatever the Affordable Care Act. But let's go back a bit in history. In 1965, President Johnson, July 1965, 48 years ago, 48 years ago and a couple months, President Johnson signed Medicare. It passed bipartisanly, although a number of Republicans were strongly against it, especially the far right. Now, in 1965, when Medicare passed, the John Birch Society didn't like it. That's sort of the Tea Party today. A lot of doctors didn't like it. A lot of insurance companies didn't like it in 1965. A lot of people that were suspicious of government overall said they didn't like it and opposed it. And a lot of them continued to oppose it after the election. But 5 years later, the country clearly was very happy with Medicare. Certainly 48 years later, the country's very happy with Medicare. I don't think there's much question that, 5 years from now, people will be happy with the Affordable Care Act. They know that it will have worked for people in this country, that that much of it already has worked, as the presiding officer knows. We already have, in my state, almost 1 million seniors have already received benefits. They've gotten free preventive care, no copays, no deductibles. People from Youngstown to Toledo, seniors from Youngstown and Toledo they've gotten screenings for osteoporosis and physicals and all, and no copay and deductible, those living on Medicare. People from Cleveland to Cincinnati, people in their 20s, 100,000 Ohioans in their 20s have been able to get have been able to go on their parents' health care plan up until the age of 26. We've seen thousands of Ohioans get a rebate check from the insurance companies because the insurance companies, because of the rules in the Affordable Care Act, have charged too much and they're getting rebates. We know a lot of those benefits have been out there. Families that have a child with a pre-existing condition are no longer being denied coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. So we know much of it has taken effect and much of it has been to the public benefit. We also know, come tomorrow, October 1st, much more of the Affordable Care Act, the rest of it will be rolled out. Seniors have saved in my state, and I think in the state of Indiana, an average of about $700. Those who are in the prescription drug plan have saved about that amount of money on their prescription drugs, again, because of the Affordable Care Act. We know that. Put that aside. Let's simply ask this House of Representatives to bring this bill up. We know what happens if we don't. A shutdown would hurt financing of more than 1,000 small businesses per week in my state, from Hamilton to Chillicothe to Mansfield to Beulah. The Small Business Administration approved nearly 54,000 applications through their credit loans program, supporting over 500,000 jobs. A shutdown would stop the ability of the SBA to loan to small businesses through this program. A shutdown would put 52,000 Ohio federal employees at risk of being out of work. Most of them, we figure, would temporarily lose jobs. We know that's a drag on the economy. We know that it would mean the government services aren't being rendered. It would mean those tens of thousands of workers wouldn't get paid. It would mean a stumbling, a faltering, a sputtering of our economic growth, the economic recovery, because people aren't making the money and putting money back into the economy. Senior citizens would be ineligible if there's a shutdown to apply for new Social Security benefits. The Social Security applications wouldn't be taken as a result of federal furloughs and service cuts. In 2012, more than 2.2 Ohioans received, obviously many of them had been receiving for years, received Social Security benefits. All we ask, Mr. President, again, is that the Speaker of the House do what you should do in a democracy. Give the elected members of Congress the opportunity to vote. Give them the opportunity to vote yes or no on the Senate passed, bipartisanly passed, continuing resolution. Again, Speaker Boehner needs to make a decision. Is he going to be the Speaker of the radical far-right Republican Party, or is he going to be the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives? That choice is clear. Bring that bill to the floor. Let all the 435 members of the House of Representatives who were elected last November and sworn in January, give them the opportunity to vote. I think if they do, it will mean the President will sign the bill before midnight. Keep this government operating. There's simply no reason that we lurch from crisis to crisis, all created by a political agenda that, frankly, most of the people in this country have at election time rejected. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And the Senate back in a quorum call, still deadlocked with the House over funding the federal government. Midnight tonight, of course, the fiscal year ends, and with it, many government services. Both chambers did pass bills to keep military pay in place in the case of a shutdown, which, as Politico reports, is looking more likely since the House is working on a funding bill with new attachments. One of those attachments would delay the individual mandate, and another would do away with subsidies for health care for Congress, staff, and those who work for the White House. And the Senate says any delays related to the health care law will not pass the Senate. And we heard from the President a short while ago. He was urging Congress to come to an agreement and avoid a shutdown.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I'd ask consent to speak as if in morning business for...
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask consent to speak as if in morning business for, I guess, up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we're here tonight in the Senate, hours away from a deadline which will, if action isn't taken on the House side, the other body, we will have a government shutdown. And unfortunately, when I've been asked today by either constituents or reporters, and they asked, is it less likely or more likely that there'll be a shutdown, I've had to be honest and say that at least at this moment, it seems more likely than less likely. And I think we have to examine not just how to try to resolve this in a way that makes sense, but also to remind ourselves how we got here. This isn't the typical battle in Washington. We've had a lot of those, and we should all try to work in a bipartisan fashion. But this one is unique in the sense that you have, on the one side, you have Democrats in Congress, and I think across the country, united in an effort to continue the operations of the government and not have a government shutdown, even if we want to make a point, even if we want to make an argument about this or that policy. You see a growing number of Republicans here in the Senate, I think across the country, maybe even a few in the House, even the last 24 hours or so, who are saying, let's just get the government funded so we can move forward. We might be able to have a debate in the middle of November or somewhere down the road, but let's not hold up the operations of government or default on our obligations for the first time since 1789 in order to make an ideological point or a political point. I think it's clear from the national data that independents are on that side of the argument as well. So you have this consensus on one side, Democrats and independents and Republicans, that you shouldn't, in order to make your point about an issue, whether it's health care or the economy or whatever it is, you shouldn't act in a way that would shut down the government to do that. On the other side, I think you have the far right of the Republican Party that not only believes that in order to make their point, they're willing to allow the government to shut down, but you also have, I think, a determination to do that to the extent that one wing of one party is really driving the train in that party. It happens to be the Republican Party. So this is unusual. It's not the typical Democrat versus Republican debate. And it started months ago where politicians who work in this town would go home to their state or their districts and make the point that they were going to, no matter what, argue that this is the moment where they should stop the health care bill. And no matter what was in their way, they were going to just continue to drive in that direction. So I think that's where that's how we've gotten here. Well, what happens if we go past the deadline and there is a shutdown of a few days or longer? Well, here's what some of the data shows, some of the folks who are not in the Congress but who observe broader trends and especially economic trends. Mark Zandi is a Moody's chief economist. He's, I think, widely respected. I think people in both parties respect his opinion. And according to him, I'm not quoting, but I'm just summarizing what he said, a shutdown lasting a few days would cost the economy 0.2% of GDP, while a longer shutdown could cost as much as 1.4%. Now, sometimes it's difficult to say what does 0.2% of GDP means. Well, what it means for sure is that the economy, which has been moving in the right direction, we've had tremendous job growth over I think 9 quarters now, many months of job growth, but we're not moving fast enough. We're not creating jobs at a fast enough pace. And when I go home to Pennsylvania, people don't say to me, score every point you can for your point of view. They say to me, work together with the other side to create jobs. Work together with the other side to put in place strategies that will lead to job growth, economic growth, and obviously job growth. So if you're going to go in the wrong direction when it comes to growth and you lose 0.2% of growth, and then if the shutdown goes longer, you lose 0.4 or 0.5 or 0.6% over time, you're obviously going in the wrong direction. But we know that when you lose even 0.2% of growth, you're killing jobs. So first and foremost, any shutdown is a big job killer. A default on our obligations would be a much bigger job killer. A shutdown would also not just slow growth, but it would spread anxiety, and this is just human nature. It will spread anxiety among consumers. We know that in the summer of 2011, the almost default on our obligations caused consumer confidence to take a nosedive. We didn't come out of that hole of consumer confidence until many months later. The government shutdown has a similar effect. How about the Chamber of Commerce? Not usually on my side of a lot of debates, or the Democratic side. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has urged Congress to keep the government open and that a shutdown would be, quote, economically disruptive and create even more uncertainties in the U.S. economy. So this is the Chamber of Commerce, which is often making arguments about uncertainty in other contexts, are saying that a shutdown would create even more uncertainty. How about the economic recovery? I mentioned those 9 quarters of growth we've had. We've had job growth as well, just in terms of how you measure it. 7.5 million jobs, private sector jobs, 7.5 million added in the last 42 months. So that will take a nosedive. So instead of growing at 160,000 jobs a month, roughly, which has been kind of the pace for a while now, which isn't fast enough. We need to be at 200 or 230 or 240 if we really want to say that the economy has taken off. But instead of growing at 160 or 170 or even higher, we hope, we'll go backwards. Maybe the job growth for the next couple of months will be substantially less than that. A shutdown all but ensures that to happen. We don't know exactly how much slowing would, or how much damage would be done to the job growth, but there's going to be a job impact for sure, and I think that's pretty clear from the data. Now, both sides in a lot of debates here in Washington say they stand up for small business. And we can debate that, which side does a better job for small business. But we know one thing. We know that when a small business person needs some help, a measure of help from the federal government, they usually turn to the Small Business Administration. And we know that the SBA, that their approval of applications for business loan guarantees and direct loans to small business would cease. Okay, so if you take the Small Business Administration off the playing field, they average about 1,000 loans or loan guarantees per week. Now that's nationally. What does that mean for Pennsylvania? Well, from October from October 2012 through August of this year, 2013, the SBA supported over 1,400 loans for over $600 million for small businesses in Pennsylvania. On average, that's about 30 loans for over $13 million to entrepreneurs each week. So every week, on average, based upon the recent data in Pennsylvania, 30 loans and $13 million helping small businesses in Pennsylvania. To shut that off would make our economic circumstance even worse. In Pennsylvania, we had many, many months in a row where the unemployment numbers were 500,000 people unemployed or more. Thankfully, it dipped below 500,000 for a couple of months. We just got the numbers from August, because the state numbers are always behind. The state data for August shows we're unfortunately just above 500,000 jobs, 500,000 people out of work. A shutdown will bring that 500,000 person out of work number higher and send it in the wrong direction. How about veterans? People say, well, veterans' disability checks will still go out, just like Social Security checks would go out in the aftermath of a shutdown. Well, that's only part of the story. If you're a veteran getting disability checks or a pension benefit, in our state we've got about 109,000. 109,000 veterans get disability or pension help. They may get their check, but it's highly likely, if not a certainty, that those checks will be delayed. Okay? So you're a veteran, and you're entitled to this because of what you did for our country, and because part of a political party wants to make an ideological point, you've got to wait for your check. You have to wait for your disability check. That makes no sense, and to say that it's unfair to a veteran or his or her family is really an understatement. How about Social Security? People say, well, the checks are going to go out, so people are going to be just fine in a shutdown. Well, that's only part of the story. Yes, current recipients will get their checks, but if you reach the age of 65 and you want to have your application process, you won't be able to do that, or at a minimum, that will be slowed substantially. In our state, every month, more than 11,500 people, about 11,600 people, are able to start the process for their Social Security benefits. Those people will have to wait and wait and wait in the advent of a government shutdown. How about national parks? We have a great blessing in our state where we have an abundance of national parks, historic sites, which are wonderful for the country, wonderful for enrichment and learning and the history, but they also are a big economic driver in different communities. In southeastern Pennsylvania, when you add it all up, one of the numbers I saw was over $200 million of impact. Those, unlike a lot of things I just talked about, those parts of the government will stop completely. So an economic engine in one part of our state that averages about $200 million of economic impact here will just stop, okay? So maybe we'll lose $10 million over the course of a shutdown. Maybe Pennsylvania will lose $20 million or $30 million. So we're going to lose for sure, and a lot of other states will as well. The Flight 93 Memorial is one of those from 9/11. Gettysburg is another. Valley Forge, Independence Park in Philadelphia. So there are lots and lots of examples and lots of job impacts when it comes to all of those. But here's the basic point. Some people would say, well, look, you're in the United States Senate or the House, and you want to have a debate about something as significant and consequential to people's lives or to our economy, like health care, and you ought to be able to debate that. I would agree with that. There's no question about it. We had big debates in 2009 leading up to a vote in the Senate. Then the debate continued into 2010. The bill was enacted in March of 2010. There was still debate about it after that. There were votes taken one after another to repeal it. Then the Supreme Court litigated it. That took months until the Supreme Court made a decision. A Supreme Court which is dominated, or at least the majority have Republican-appointed justices. They said the Affordable Care Act was constitutional. Then you had a presidential election, which was another kind of litigation or debate. And one candidate said, I'm going to keep the Affordable Care Act in place and we're going to implement it. The other side said, we're going to repeal it. Well, the side that said they were going to put it in effect won the election, meaning President Obama. So this has been debated and litigated several different ways in several different branches of our government. That will continue. And frankly, it should continue, because some of the impacts are already in place. We know that. We know, for example, that since 2010, when the consumer protections went into effect, which had nothing to do initially with those who were uninsured, the tens of millions uninsured, but we put in place the consumer protections for those with insurance, those who had coverage, were making payments or premium payments, and yet their children were still not protected because of a pre-existing condition. So up until 2010, it was the law, or it was the prevailing policy that if an insurance company wanted to say to you who were paying premiums, sorry, I know you're making your payments, but your child has a pre-existing condition, they are not covered. Okay, that was permitted when insurance companies had all the power. I would argue all the power and an unfair advantage in bargaining power. So now you have, since 2010, something on the order of 17 million children who can no longer be denied coverage due to a pre-existing condition solely and completely because of the Affordable Care Act. You have millions of young people who can stay on their parents' policies from the age of 19 to 25. They can only stay on those policies solely because of the Affordable Care Act, because it was enacted into law. You have millions of seniors who are getting payments over time to help them fill the coverage gap, the so-called donut hole. They're getting those payments solely because of the Affordable Care Act. Now, tomorrow, we're going to see the beginning of the exchanges going up, where people can go into a marketplace and shop for the best possible health care insurance that they can afford. Most people, probably as many as 150 million Americans, already have coverage, and their employer provides it. So their status won't change that much, if at all. But these things are going into effect over time, so I would hope the people who want to keep debating it and make changes to it, and I voted for changes as well, would allow it to be, if not fully implemented, something close to fully over the next couple of months, or maybe even the next couple of years. And then at some point, this debate about who is right or who is wrong about the impact will have been determined. So we're all for debates on the budget and on health care and everything else, but we shouldn't bring the country to these cliffs. The cliff meaning this deadline tonight on the budget, where the House has our legislation, which is just about the budget. They could pass it. It will pass, by the way, if the Speaker puts it on the floor tonight. It would pass. We would be beyond this crisis. Then we'd move to the next deadline, and we could get beyond these deadlines and then have a big debate and have very strong arguments made about how we get a full year's worth of a budget starting in the middle of November. That's the appropriate time and the appropriate place to make arguments about the budget or the economy or jobs or health care or whatever else it is. Now is not the time, and I would hope that between now and midnight, the House would put our bill, which is very simple, I mean, just keeps the government operating with no conditions and no add-ons. And pass that legislation, we'd be done with this. We could move on to issues that I think people want us to work on. I'll restate what I said before. People in Pennsylvania, when they say to me what they want me to do, they say work together to create jobs. That's, if you had to put it in a soundbite, that's what it is. So I'm hoping that between now and then, this consensus of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents that I think prevails throughout the country will have the appropriate influence on those who are trying to push this to the end and shut down the government. A government shutdown is bad for everybody, no matter what party you're in, and we should keep working to make sure that it doesn't happen. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, earlier today the Senate rejected for the second time a House Republican continuing resolution. Now that approach that they've adopted over in the House attempts and would deprive millions of Americans of health insurance if it were passed here. It's not going to pass here. So I would say to Speaker Boehner, we've given your proposal now a vote. In fact, we've voted on it twice. Now you owe it to the American people to hold a vote on the bipartisan, clean continuing resolution, which would keep the government open, a resolution which the Senate sent to you just a few hours ago. The only thing, Mr. President, preventing us from keeping this government open is Speaker Boehner's refusal to bring a bipartisan Senate continuing resolution to the House floor. And I think most Republicans over there even acknowledge that it would pass if Speaker Boehner would allow a vote on it. The Senate just a short time ago, Mr. President, approved a measure to allow for the pay of our men and women in uniform to continue in the event of a government shutdown. This measure was necessary because requiring our military to go into combat, for instance, with only an IOU instead of pay would be a travesty. But nobody should be fooled. It's just one travesty that was avoided among many. Even if we restrict our view to the impact of a government shutdown on the military, there are many other terrible impacts of a government shutdown. Now, our military members would be paid, so a shutdown would result in at least avoiding that problem. However, there are other unthinkable outcomes of a government shutdown on our security. Family members of military members who die in combat would not receive death benefits during a shutdown. It defies belief that in the pursuit of a narrow ideological goal, House Republicans would prevent the payment of benefits for those who die defending our country. That is the result of a government shutdown. In the event of a shutdown, the Department of Defense would also further reduce already curtailed training and bring routine maintenance to a halt, exacerbating the corrosive effects that sequestration is already having on military readiness. The Department of Defense would be barred from entering most new contracts that would harm modernization programs. A shutdown would severely curtail medical services for troops and their families. Commissaries would close. Hundreds of thousands of civilian employees, workers vital to our defense, would be laid off. Outside of the DOD, a shutdown would disrupt some operations of the Department of Veterans Affairs that are providing benefits for those who have served. And there is the extraordinary disruption of having to plan for all this absurdity. As Undersecretary of Defense Hale said on Friday, quote, even if a lapse never occurs, the planning itself is disruptive. People are worrying right now about whether their paychecks are going to be delayed rather than focusing fully on their mission. And while I can't qualify, he said, the time being spent to plan, it has or will consume a lot of senior management attention, probably thousands of hours in employee time better spent on supporting national security. And again, that only covers the impact on our military and on our veterans. While Border Patrol agents and FBI agents would continue to work, they would be putting their lives on the line for an IOU instead of for a check, a paycheck. Health clinics would stop taking new patients. Life-saving research would grind to a halt. The far-reaching effects of a shutdown on government services across the country should give us all pause, as should the fact that a shutdown is likely to damage the all-too-fragile economic recovery. Now, this has gone on for far too long, and Speaker Boehner can end it now. There's still time for him to bring to the floor of the House of Representatives a clean continuing resolution and avert a government shutdown. For the good of our men and women in uniform and our national security, for the good of our economy, and for the millions of Americans who rely on and who benefit from important federal programs, I hope the Speaker will allow our bipartisan continuing resolution to be voted on. I hope, Mr. President, that even this late in the game, that reason is going to prevail. I hold that hope in part because while House Republicans have put Tea Party ideology ahead of the good of the nation, many of our Republican colleagues here in the Senate have not. These members recognize that there's a difference between, on the one hand, debating serious policy preferences, and on the other hand, threatening government shutdown if you don't get your way. All of us in the Senate have issues on which we feel every bit as passionately as the opponents of the Affordable Care Act feel about that law. I happen to feel strongly, for instance, that we should have universal background checks for firearm purchases. By the Tea Party method of proving the strength of my belief, I should threaten a government shutdown if I don't get what I want on that subject. If all of us threaten legislative anarchy in pursuit of our goals, democracy would cease to function. And as appalled as I am that some members would threaten such damage to our nation, I am heartened that many of our Republican colleagues here in the Senate have spoken out in opposition to this approach. When I came to the floor last week to speak on this topic, Senator Ayotte was speaking. I commended her for saying that the American people expect us to keep the government running, even though I disagreed with much of what she said about the Affordable Care Act. I commend Senator Collins for saying that a shutdown, quote, will only further damage our struggling economy, and that we should resolve our differences, quote, without resorting to constant brinkmanship and the threat of government shutdown. And I commend Senator Collins, even though I disagree with her on the Affordable Care Act. I commend her for taking that position against the shutdown and for seeing the distinction between fighting hard for what you believe in and threatening to bring down government operations overall if you don't get what you want. I commend Senator Portman for saying that differences on the Affordable Care Act, quote, ought to be handled outside the context of a government shutdown, close quote. I commend Senator Chambliss for saying that while, in his words, he'd love to fund Obamacare, that a government shutdown is, quote, going to do great harm to the American people if we pursue that course, close quote. I commend Senator Kirk for saying, quote, let's not shut down the government just because you don't get everything you want, close quote. And there are others who have made that critically important distinction between opposing a certain policy and shutting down the government if one doesn't get his or her way. I welcome spirited debate. I welcome differences of opinion. As my friend Senator McCain said last week, there was plenty of both during the debate on the passage of the Affordable Care Act. But it is deeply distressing to hear members of Congress argue that the litmus test of whether you're fighting for your beliefs is whether you're willing to shut down the government if you don't achieve a particular goal. That's more than fighting for your position. That's wanton destruction. I hope at least some House Republicans will come to see the difference between fighting for your goals and sowing anarchy in pursuit of them. Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.